Hello everyone, Hyper here, and in today's video we'll be talking about all of the 8.1 DK changes that I think are pretty important. First, I will go over the general changes and mainly PvE changes, and then I will talk more in depth about the PvP changes because I know a majority of my audience is mostly interested in PvE. But just to start off the whole thing, DKs for a general change, this is for Unholy and for Frost, it does not affect Blood. Death Strike cost was reduced by 10 runic power and it increases its healing by 60%, and this was previously 40%. So they basically buffed our Death Strike a little bit by increasing the healing and reducing the cost, which has a little bit of an effect in PvP, but in PvE I doubt you will see much change, because probably 90-95% of the time when you Death Strike in PvE, you do it because you got a free proc, and you don't really do it just for the healing purposes. The healing is kind of a secondary thing. So the other thing that was changed is actually a buff. So they added Veteran of the Third War to all specs, and it provides 10% extra stamina for Frost and Unholy, and it still provides 60% for Blood. However, for Blood DK, they removed the 15% armor component. So that affects Blood quite a bit, because a 15% armor loss is a huge deal. Now this, again, 10% extra stamina for Frost and Unholy. It's nice for probably PvP. In PvE, I didn't really feel like we had issue with stamina because we have a few tools to deal, especially with magic damage. But overall, I feel like along with AZERITE traits, DKs weren't that squishy in PvE. For Mythic Plus, however, this does increase our viability at the higher end. So now looking at the spec-specific changes, so for Blood, they changed Bone Storm, and they made it so it can only heal you for a maximum of 15% of your health. Previously, you healed for 3% of your maximum health every time your Bone Storm tick damage. So if you had 3 targets, then you would tick for 9% of your health, and so on and so on. However, when you did huge pulls, this was very noticeable in Mythic Plus, or if you're Blood DK and did like the massive Vectis pull or the Zula Rune pull, you probably noticed that as soon as you press Bone Storm in a huge group of mobs, you're essentially unkillable. And as soon as your Bone Storm runs out, if you don't have something else, you're almost instantly dying. So to kind of remedy this, especially to make them more balanced in Dungeons and Mythic Plus, they changed it so you can only heal for a maximum of 15% of your health per tick. So every time your healing ticks. The second thing is Purgatory no longer clears on death. Okay. This is again a Mythic Plus thing, and even for that, you only did it at the higher end, where if you don't even do it really anymore because you run Bone Storm, but you used to, whenever you ran Purgatory, if you procced it, you would let the mobs kill you, your team would res you, and you would go on, so you would have Purgatory again. So I don't know how I feel about this change, especially now that Bone Storm is definitely less viable. We might see people start using Purgatory more, but this nerfed Purgatory also makes it a lot weaker than it was previously, because previously you essentially always had it available because you would pull around. So Purgatory was essentially just a safety net for massive pulls, and as soon as you're done with the pull, if you proc Purgatory, then you would die and be rezzed. If you didn't proc it, then you just move on. Then the third nerf to Blood DK is Will of the Necropolis now reduces damage taken below 30% by 30%, and this was reduced from 35% and 35%. So this is pretty much the only viable talent right now in their row, and it's been nerfed a little bit. It's not that huge of a nerf. I think among the other 2 changes, this is probably the most minor nerf, or the other 3 changes if we count Veteran of the Third War nerf. This is the most minor nerf. I think it's just to kind of bring it in line in that row, so sometimes you can actually take some other choices. But the overall philosophy here is that Blood DK is too strong in Mythic Plus. So let's nerf Blood DK. But a lot of tanks talked about this, that Blood Decay was one of the few tanks that actually felt good to play Mythic Plus. And instead of bringing up the other tanks, you know, buffing them to the level of Blood Decay, because tanks in general got massively nerfed going from Legion into BFA. So Blood Decay was one of the few which remained almost unchanged. It felt a little slower to play, and we lost some tool spells that were pretty good utility, such as the range on Warfiends, or the massive shield after Vamp Blood. But Blood Decay still felt really good to play Mythic Plus. And the other tanks were kind of lackluster, and what Blizzard did here, instead of bringing up the other tanks to the level of Blood Decay, they brought Blood Decay down to the level of the other tanks, which I really don't agree with. Drinking my morning coffee here in the meantime. Moving on to Frost. So for Frost, again, it's nerfs. Breath of Sindragosa damage decreased by 10%. Just a 10% nerf to our BOS, and how much this will affect you will largely depend on how your damage breakdown looks. So on single target, for example, if Breath of Sindragosa did 20% of your total damage, I'm just making a number up, this will vary person to person, but if Breath of Sindragosa did 20% of your damage and it was nerfed by 10%, then this would be a 2% overall damage nerf. But you can kind of figure this out by looking at your own damage breakdown. Then they also changed this, so Dreadwake armor 2-piece, with Dreadwake, I believe, was either DOS or Argus. Value was reduced to 3% from 15%, and this increased our Howling Blast damage. I guess some people were cheesing it. I don't really see why they put this in the patch notes. But moving on to Unholy. But before we move on though, so for Frost, what does the 10% BOS nerf mean? It will be pretty noticeable in your burst phase. Your overall damage will, you know, be slightly nerfed, but the biggest change you will see is in your burst phase right after Breath of Sindragosa ends. That is when you will see the biggest swing in damage now compared to the previous patch. So Unholy, All Will Serve Skulker Shot damage reduced by 15%. All Will Serve was basically the go-to talent on single target in that row, so this just brought it in line with the rest of the talents, which, again, Unholy is not exactly the best place right now for single targets, so again, maybe instead of nerfing it, try buffing the other talents, but who am I to say? The second change here is that Bursting Swords now affects all nearby targets, so instead of being target capped, I believe at 8 targets it was previously, it affects all targets. And the third and perhaps biggest change, which they put for some reason in the PvE section of the patch notes, Death and Decay's Necrotic Strike now also hits up to 3 additional targets. So this means when you Death and Decay and you Necrotic Strike, you will cleave that Necrotic Strike to 3 additional targets. And obviously in PvE this doesn't happen because we don't have Necrotic Strike, but in PvP this will be a huge change, and I will talk a little bit more about this when I get to the PvP patch notes. Moving on to the AZERITE traits, because some of them were removed and some new ones were added. So first of all, for Blood, we got a new trait, which is Bloody Runeblade, and this replaced Embrace of the Darkfallen. So what Bloody Runeblade does is when Crimson Scourge activates, you gain 259 haste for 5 seconds and immediately gain 5 runic power. So Crimson Scourge is our free proc, and getting haste, a little bit of haste whenever we get a proc and getting some runic power is kind of nice. Typically you will get a proc very early on when you do a trash pull, so this will maybe give you a little bit more haste or a little bit more runic power generation, because you get that runic power and you also get more haste, so your runes are coming back quicker. This is an okay trait. I think that maybe if you can get 3 of them. I haven't tested if the runic power gain stacks. I assume that the haste will stack, so if you have 3 of them you'll get triple the amount of haste. But I don't know if you will get 15 runic power, so that needs to be tested. The second trait here is Cold Hearted. Icebound Fortitude heals for 1908. I assume this scales based on the level of your AZERITE piece every second, and its cooldown is reduced by 15 seconds. So this is okay for blood. For Frost, the 15-second cooldown reduction on Icebound Fortitude is essentially meaningless. And also healing throughout Icebound Fortitude. This might be good for PvP, especially for rogues, because they tend to use like Vendetta and then Kidney Shot you then Vendetta. So you can essentially Icebound throughout their Vendetta, or like a part of it at least. So this will be probably a decent defensive trait for PvP from as far as I'm seeing right now. The next trait here is Frostwhelp's Indignation. And this replaces Glacial Contagion, which is one of the Frost traits. And it was probably our third best single target trait outside of Raid, or our second best outside of Raid, third best in Raid, behind Tidal Surge. And what this does is that whenever you use Pillar of Frost, a Frostwhelp comes down who breathes on all enemies within 20 yards in front of you for X amount of frost damage. And more importantly, each unique enemy hit by Frostwhelp's Indignation grants you 35 mastery for 6 seconds, up to 175. So the mastery cap on this again goes up depending on your AZERITE level. And this is kind of a weird change because they essentially took out a purely single target trait. So from Glacial Contagion, which made it so targets affected by Glacial Contagion would take extra damage from your obliterates. They took out a purely single target trait and they changed it over to essentially an AoE trait. Frostwhelps on single target is absolutely garbage. Don't even bother trying it. On Cleave, it's kind of weak. It really only shines once you get to AoE. Once you get to big AoE and you're able to use that Pillar of Frost Lung with Breath of Sindragosa, so you get the Frostwhelp's damage and you get the extra mastery inside your Breath of Sindragosa, and then the mastery also if you choose to use Frostborn's Fury. That is a huge change because mastery is such a valuable stat. So for that short duration, it's essentially like having an extra potion. But in raiding, I don't know how much use this will see. Obviously, in Uldir, there's a few bosses where there's a lot of enemies, such as Mother, depending on what strat you go with. Or if you go to Zul, bosses like that have a lot of adds. But I don't see how much use this will actually see on progress. This is definitely a Mythic Plus trait. And in Mythic Plus also, this is probably worth mentioning, it has a 20-yard cone, so it's not a huge cone, but you still kind of risk pulling some stuff with it. It's just a thought. Then for Unholy, Hell Chains, which replaces Horrid Experimentation, which was one of our best AZERITE traits for dungeons and AoE. Dark Transformation links you and your pet with chains that deal 467 fire damage. So I need to check this in game, but if it actually deals fire damage, then it's absolutely garbage. Actually, not garbage since our master doesn't scale with it anymore. But I don't know why it would be fire instead of frost or shadow. Anyway, X amount of fire damage every second between you for 15 seconds. So this essentially puts in an extra point of you having to micromanage your pet and where you stand in comparison to your pet. So pets tend to always move behind the target. And you, as a high-skilled player, because you watch my channel, you also tend to move behind the target. Because behind the target, it won't parry you. So essentially, your pet is behind the target and you're behind the target, and everything between you two takes damage. There's nothing between you two. So this means that either you have to stand to the side of the targets or move your pet over in a place with like a move pet macro where all of the enemies are between you and your pet. And this is, of course, if I'm understanding this new trait correctly. So this trait could be a little finicky. We'll see how it actually works out. And then the last trait, which is again for Unholy, is Magus of the Dead, and this replaces Festering Doom. Apocalypse and Army of the Damned additionally summon a Magus of the Dead who hurls Frostbolts and Shadow Bolts at your foes, dealing X damage each. So this is interesting. On the very first day, got a 50% nerf in PvP as a hotfix. So this is essentially a single target trait. I don't know if he cleaves AoE, much like Skulker Shot, but I'm assuming this is a purely single target trait. So this could be good, could be bad. It all will come down to how well it scales with eye level. Moving on to the decay changes for PvP. Decomposing Aura now only applies to Blood and Unholy Death Knights rather than all 3 specs. Heartstop Aura now only applies to Blood and Frost decays. And also they buffed it to decrease the recovery rate of abilities by 30% rather than 20%. Dark Simulacrum cost reduced to none from 20 runic power. This is a huge change. And its cooldown decreased to 20 seconds from 25 seconds. That change is not that big, but the runic power cost being 0 is huge because there's a lot of situations where you kind of had to sit on your runic power when you're playing against Resto Druids. That is the most common enemy that you take Dark Sim against because you steal a Cyclone and then you cast it back on them. So you kind of had to sit on your runic power and never really be able to deplete all your runic power in case the druid was casting a clone and you're out of runic power. So I really like this change. This is just a nice quality of life change. You could play around it before, but this just makes it a little more user friendly. New PvP talent for Frost and Unholy is Transfusion, and this generates 20 runic power and reduces the runic power cost of Death Strike by 50% for 7 seconds. I have to check exactly how this works with like Gargoyle, for example, because it's worth noting that Gargoyle gets buffed by the amount of runic power you spend. So if they actually calculate the runic power spent based on just the base cost of the ability, you can essentially get twice as many Death Strikes for half the runic power, so to buff your Gargoyle a lot more. But if it only buffs it by 50% of the Death Strike cost, then it's not that worth it. So overall, this is just a defensive talent that will be pretty much used for survivability on longer drawn-out fights. Now for Frost specifically, a new PvP talent is Dead of Winter. After your Remorseless Winter deals damage 5 times to a target, they are stunned for 4 seconds. And your Remorseless Winter's cooldown is increased by 25 seconds, and its radius is reduced to 5 yards. They essentially have to be in melee range of the target. I don't know how I feel about this. In Legion, we had this version, but essentially better. So this is a budget version of the Legion Remorseless Winter. In Legion, it did the same thing, but you weren't penalized with its cooldown and its radius. I don't know how much use this will see, because if you get peeled even a little bit out of range, you're not able to actually stun your target. And it's also a little RNG and people can see it coming. That was always the biggest thing with it. Once you saw Remorseless Winter ticking, you knew that you were going to be stunned. Against people like, or classes like Rogues, for example, you don't know exactly when you get stunned. You have an idea, but with this, you can, for example, as a Rogue, you can feint right before the 5th tick goes off. Or as a mage, you can Ice Barrier or Blink Away right before the 5th tick. There's things like that you can do, which makes it not all that great. Chill Streak was once again buffed. This is one of those abilities that gets buffed and nerfed basically every patch. They buffed it up to 6% per tick, down or up from 3% per tick. So we'll see if there ends up being a Chill Streak build. Against melee cleaves, I feel like this might make a comeback, but we'll see. Death Chill was reworked, and it is now applied by Remorseless Winter and Chains of Ice instead of Death Grip, and now roots the target in place for 4 seconds. So this is okay, but keep in mind that if you run the new PvP talent Dead of Winter, then you're only going to root the first person in melee range with your Remorseless Winter. So you basically need to rely on your Chains of Ice. I think this is pretty nice. It basically makes our chains a root rather than just a slow. So this will address some of those mobility issues. And Delirium was changed to last for 15 seconds from previously 8 seconds. I don't know exactly what this means, but it's a buff to Delirium. I don't actually know how many people are running this talent in PvP though. So for Unholy, this is where a lot of the changes are, which are quite interesting. New PvP talent is Lichborn. Become undead for 10 seconds, all damage reduced by 30%, and you're immune to stun, snare, and fear, and roots, but you cannot move faster than 50% of normal speed. So that's interesting because it's a DR that slows you. So it's a DR and it's immune to basically all crowd control that slows you. But can I Death's Advance and then press Lichborn and have that DR be immune to all those CCs but move at normal speed? So there's kind of a synergy there. Second new PvP talent is Life and Death. When targets afflicted by your Festering Wound are healed, you're also healed for 10% of the amount. Your Virulent Plague now erupts for 400 of the normal eruption damage when dispelled. So this was basically taking an old talent and combining it into a new one. So Life and Death, I think, is probably one of the most important talents that they added, because Unholy DK is one of those classes that you will play in rot comps. So you will play it, the games will be drawn out, and it will come down to overall healing output and just being able to spread damage to every target. So as long as you keep your Festering Wounds on all 3 of the enemies, you're going to be getting a lot of extra healing on yourself. And also you get the extra Virulent Plague damage eruption. So this is a very nice talent, and I'm pretty sure this will be a go-to for PvP. And another new PvP talent is Necromancer's Bargain. The cooldown of your Apocalypse is reduced by 45 seconds. Your Apocalypse applies Crypt Fever to the target, and Crypt Fever deals up to 8% of the target's maximum health and shadow damage over 4 seconds. Healing spells cast on this target will refresh the duration of Crypt Fever. I don't know exactly how this interacts with HOTS. So if HOTS refresh it, then this will be an extremely good thing against Resto Druids. But if only direct heals refresh the Crypt Fever, then you know, it might be very good against classes like Shamans, Holy Paladins, things like that. So this again is another talent that is very interesting and has a lot of potential. Another new PvP talent is Raise Abomination. Raises an abomination for 25 seconds, which wanders and attacks enemies near where it was summoned, applying Festering Wound when it melees the targets, and affecting all those nearby with Virulent Plague. Again, very, very interesting, because this essentially means that the Walking Dead comp from Legion and previous expansions is going to make a pretty big comeback. Because one big tactic with that was that you stacked up the 2 DPS and then you gripped in the healer, leg sweep all of them, and then just cleave damage. So with this Raise Abomination, you can essentially get your Abomination on all 3 of the targets. They will all be affected by Festering Wounds. They will all be affected by Virulent Plague. And if you take the other talent, which heals you back and increases the eruption damage, there's a lot of synergy between the talents here. So I really like what they did to Unholy. The Frost changes are not all that important in my opinion. I doubt Frost will see much play in Arena, but Unholy is definitely going to make a comeback this patch, especially compared to the last patch. And we will see a lot more comps that play Unholy DK. So I'm looking forward to this PvP season as an Unholy DK. These talents are pretty cool in design, but we'll see how they actually work out in the arena. So this was kind of a longer drawn out video, but DK had a lot of changes to it. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, then please hit the like button and sub to the channel. And as always, if you'd like to support me directly, check out my Patreon in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.